FanDuel is giving all new customers a shot at $250 in bonus bets. Join FanDuel today. You'll get started with $250 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. From three-pointers to steals to assists, FanDuel has so many ways to bet your favorite player props. Plus, after the game tips off, you can even combine live prop bets into a same-game parlay for a chance to win big. Just visit FanDuel.com/sportsfan to get in on all the NBA play-in tournament action. That's FanDuel.com/sportsfan for your shot at $250 in bonus bets.
What comes to your mind when you hear me say penguin? Now, I'm not talking about that Batman character. How about this character? How about those black and white animals that waddle when they walk? You know how like Charlie Chaplin used to do in those old silent movies? In today's episode, Professor Richard Reina, he joins me. Now, he's an expert on the response animals have to the environment, but most importantly, he's also an expert on the little penguin. It's also called the fairy penguin and the little blue penguin. You heard me right, the little blue penguin. Now, I'll bet most of you didn't know that. And yes, there really are blue penguins. These little guys are the smallest penguin, and you can find them in New Zealand and Australia. Richard, get ready, dives, did you get it? Way deep into these beautiful guys. We talk penguin divorce. No, I'm not going to tell you what that means. You're going to have to listen to the episode, and so much more. Now, these threatened, really cute animals are fascinating. I'm excited for you to meet Richard and these little fairies. Now, the last thing I want you to think about is this. You know how when guys are wearing a tuxedo and they call it their penguin suit? Well, does that mean now they can wear a blue and white penguin suit too? I'm just saying. Anyways, get ready to learn all about little blue penguins.
For real, 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 for real. Got a bunch of furry friends and I love them all the same. I'm an animal lover, veterinarian is the name. Let's share some pet stories from heartwarming to strange, losses and gains, from wacky to insane. For real. You're now tuned in to For Real with your host, Mark Kyle.
Hey, everybody, and welcome back to the For Real podcast. You know, I always say this, but this is a good one for me. I love anybody from down under to begin with, but my guest today is Richard Reina, and we're going to be talking about the small penguin, the little penguin, the fairy penguin. They've got a bunch of names, and this is a good one. And I'll bet you, for all you people here in the U.S., you don't know that much about them, but when you start hearing about them, they're pretty special. Richard, thanks so much for taking the time.
My pleasure, Mark.
Well, let's get into what I want to do is talk about your background before we get into these guys, how you got where you are, because I know you do a lot more than that. You know, you're in Monash in Melbourne, by the way, for a shout out to Melbourne. I love Melbourne. You know, one of the things I was reading about your title, I have a hard time even saying the word, but Ecophysiology of Marine Vertebrae, which is really a long name. So, but before we get to that definition, let's talk about you growing up and how you got to where you are.
Sure. Well, I actually grew up, ironically, I'm a marine biologist who came from a city with no ocean, in that I grew up in Canberra, which is the capital of Australia. A lot of people don't know that. But Canberra is inland, but we used to go to the coast for holidays and go camping for a couple of weeks every year and so on, down the south coast of New South Wales. And I just loved being by the ocean there, looking around in the rock pools and so on. And after I finished high school and went to university and studied science, I was initially mainly studying zoology, not particularly marine biology. It was later that the focus became more on marine biology. After I finished my undergraduate years, and I worked in the private sector for a little while before going back to university to do my PhD. And ecophysiology, as you mentioned before, is really about understanding how animals adapt to environmental challenges and how they respond, basically how animals solve the problems that their environments present to them. And so my PhD project was with sea turtles, and in particular on the way that sea turtles regulate their salt and water, because of course living in a marine environment they never get fresh water to drink.
Right.
And in the case of sea turtles, and actually penguins is the same, they have a special salt gland, And so they have a gland that excretes a highly saline solution, which is the way they get rid of all the salt that they're constantly ingesting.
So basically, real quickly, so basically like a desalination plant kind of a thing?
Yeah, exactly. And so they can drink seawater
Wow.
and then excrete the salt that it contains in a lesser volume of water than they have just drunk, and that way they have fresh water left
Oh,
over.
wow, that's fascinating.
And one of the really interesting things about salt glands actually is that a lot of different animals have them. Saltwater crocodiles have them on the tongue. Marine iguanas it's a nasal salt gland. Birds, it's a nasal salt gland. Sea turtles, it's behind the eye. And they all, in terms of structure, look really, really similar, but they've derived from different embryonic tissues, meaning that it's not just the same gland present in all these different animals, but evolutionarily, they have all solved the same problem with the same solution.
Right.
But it's a very good example of convergent evolution. But anyway, I did my PhD work with sea turtles, and that was sort of really which put me on the path then of working primarily with marine animals.
Right.
And so these days now, as you mentioned, I'm at Monash University in Melbourne. I had spent quite a lot of time in Latin America, in Costa Rica. I also lived in the United States for 4 years. I was working in Philadelphia. And so during that time, I kind of broadened. I still do quite a lot of work with sea turtles of different kinds, but it also includes now penguins, as we're going to talk about today, and impacts of fisheries on native shark species here in Australia. Surprisingly, also, I've done a little bit of work with bears. I had a PhD student who's recently finished and was looking at stress in bears in the region of Europe around Croatia and Bosnia and that sort of general area where there's quite a lot of European bears. But basically, the common theme is understanding how animals use their biology to respond to environmental challenges. And you would call that ecophysiology, and then I use that information to develop better management and conservation programs.
So a couple of questions. First off, it seems to me, I spent some time, I think we talked about this. I do a lot of refugee work in conflict zone, and I was in Ukraine about 6 months into this crazy war that's going on, but they have bears there too, right?
I would think so, yes.
Yeah. So, one of the crazy things, and we're completely off subject, but one of the crazy things is that when the Russians actually invaded them right away, they buried a lot of landmines, and a lot of the animal life has been affected by stepping on these mines and either killing them or maiming them, which is this horrible.
Yeah,
thing.
Terrible.
So, but getting back to their eye, the salt being in their eyes. I understand it's a filtration, getting rid of the salt and filtering the salt out. How does it get to the eye? So when they drank it through their mouth and then it filters by their eye, can you give me a little bit of a...
Well, when they drink or eat anything containing salt, that salt enters the bloodstream.
Right. Okay.
And so these glands are filtering the blood. It's an active pump in the sense that it uses energy to move sodium and chloride out of the blood into the gland and then excrete it through a duct. In the sea turtles, a duct in the eye. And as I mentioned, saltwater crocodiles, it operates in a very similar way, but the glands are on the tongue.
Right.
And so the salt comes onto the tongue, and then the crocodile flushes its mouth out with water to wash that salt away. But gets the same benefit of sort of a net gain of fresh water.
That's pretty cool. I really like that. Well, you can tell I'm not the scientist, and you are right away when it comes to that thing. So quick question again, off subject. So you were in Costa Rica or Melbourne because you're up there by Bells and the monuments. Are you a surfer as well, by any chance?
No. Having grown up in Canberra, so not by the coast, I didn't really have enough opportunity to do that. I did try a bit of surfing when I was in Latin America and would like to, but no, I never really became a regular surfer.
Well, I tell everybody I surf, I do, but when I say I surf, it's not really what everybody thinks is surfing. It's like when I say I'm going running, there's a lot of walking involved. So when I'm surfing, there's a lot of paddling, me not catching a wave. So I totally get that. Anyways, I always digress. So anyway, so you were studying that. You started with turtles, and how did you get to penguins?
When I came to Melbourne, which was actually around 2003, so over 20 years ago, um, I was aware that there is a mega colony of little penguins near Melbourne. It's a place called Phillip Island. It's about 2 hours away from the centre of Melbourne, as well as a couple of smaller colonies, including a very healthy one in a Melbourne suburb called St Kilda. And those penguins are actually originally from Phillip Island because Melbourne is positioned on a very large bay,
Mm-hmm.
and penguins from Phillip Island can swim into the bay, and they established a colony with that. And that's another story that maybe we'll have time to talk about. But I was aware that this colony of penguins was down at Phillip Island, and I got in contact with the Phillip Island Nature Park, which has a research team there. And I met a colleague. His name is Andre Chiaradia. He's Brazilian, but has lived in Australia for a long time. And he was heading up their penguin research program at Phillip Island. And he and I just got in contact and discovered sort of we had some fairly shared interests. And we started things off by co-supervising an honours student. And we've actually had an honours student every year since then. And so we set up a project for our honours students. They usually move down to the island for the summer and work in the penguin colony, answering research questions about the penguin ecology, their foraging patterns and other things, their reproductive success and so on. And so Andre and I have collaborated together with honours students, with PhD students and other research ever since then, basically. So that's how the connection formed with the penguins.
Okay, I want to get into the science, but for everybody that's listening that may not know about these guys, can you talk about how big they are, what they look like, and all that kind of stuff, and then we'll get into the other really cool stuff.
Sure. So, as you mentioned at the beginning of the show, there are a few different names. They used to be called, in Australia, they used to be called fairy penguins. They became called the little penguin subsequently. In New Zealand, they have the same species. They call them little blues. But the penguins are the smallest species of penguin, so they only stand about sort of 30 centimetres tall at the most. They weigh around a kilogram, so that's a little bit less than 2.5 pounds, and they are the smallest of all the penguins. They live in a giant colony at Phillip Island. The colony's about 30 or 35,000 birds. Because they're birds, they're air breathers, but of course they spend most of their time, or a lot of their time, in the ocean. And being highly adapted to an ocean life means that they no longer fly. But they're very, very good divers. So the action that they use when they dive it looks like flying, as in they beat their flippers as wings, but it propels them through the water. Once they come out onto land, they can't fly, so they walk around. And so, unlike other seabirds, the birds that fly, penguins are true divers, and so they're spending all their time at sea foraging, looking for fish. The little penguins will dive to around 60 meters depth, which is quite extraordinary for an animal as small as that.
Yeah, they're tiny.
And they do that, then they hold their breath, they might stay submerged for a few minutes, and then come to the surface and make these repeated dives. And we've gathered a lot of information about their diving behavior by using small devices. They're called time depth recorders that you can attach to the penguin, and it registers the depth of the water that they're in and the time they spend. So we know when they come to the surface and when they dive. And then by using accelerometers and so on, we can measure their hunting behaviors and their strategies of when they chase prey and when they capture it and so on. So anyway, these penguins spend a great deal of their time at sea, but because they're birds, they lay eggs, and that means they need to come back to land to breed, hence the colony. And so they breed over the summer, so that's the southern summer at the end of the year, and dig burrows in the hillside. The burrow might be a meter deep or something like that, and lay a couple of eggs. The parents raise the chicks. Usually both eggs will hatch, but most commonly only one of the chicks survives to fledging. And during that time, the parents are spending a lot of their time at sea foraging, coming back to the colony with fish to feed the chicks until hopefully the chicks fledge. And so penguins are relatively long-lived. Most of them will sort of live 6, 7, 8 years, something like that. But there are some in the colony that have lived 12 or more years, and that's a natural colony. And those that you might find sort of in captive situations in a zoo will live even longer.
Well, a couple things. One is they have blue eyes too, right?
Yeah, actually, the eye color is highly variable. We did do a project one year with a student taking photos because we were looking at the variation in the color of the eye. Yeah, it's usually a blue, but it can be anything yellowy color or something in between.
And the other thing too is I just find these guys just so cute. But the other thing is that when you were talking about the male and the female go foraging, but the male and the female they split time. It's one of the few animals that actually stay with the babies until they're, I guess, is it fledgling or after that when they're doing that? But they'll go out hunting. The mom will go hunting, and then the dad will go hunting the next time, right?
Yes. So when they lay the eggs, for the first couple of weeks while that egg is developing, it's called the incubation period. One of the parents needs to be with the eggs all the time. And so they will take turns to sit on the nest while the other one is out at sea. Then when the chicks hatch, or the eggs hatch and they have chicks, for the early stage, again, one of the parents needs to always be with the chicks for protection, basically, and to keep it warm. And at that time, the chicks need to be fed, and they need to be fed regularly. So this is called the guard stage, and during the guard stage, for a couple of weeks, one parent will be at sea and then come back to the colony, and they alternate, but they make 1 day long trips. So one of the parents will leave the colony just before dawn, spend all day foraging at sea, come back to the colony at night, feed the chick, and then early the next morning, the other parent will leave. And so they alternate that with these 1 day trips. And that's to make sure that the chick is always accompanied by a parent, but also is being regularly fed. When the chick gets a little bit older, it can be left on its own. And that's called the post-guard stage. And when that happens, both parents will be out at sea, feeding, returning to the colony to feed the chick, and they make longer trips. So the chicks at that age don't have to be fed every day, although they grow fastest if they are fed every day. But the parents might spend 2 or 3 days out at sea, depending on how abundant and how close the food is. So once they've captured enough food for themselves and to feed the chick, then they return.
Well, maybe as humans, we should figure that out too, where we split the deal so we have good mother and fathers in the real world.
Well, it is a very equal share of raising the chicks, and that's not very common even among birds, but not very common among many animals.
Yeah, I know. I think it's impressive. So again, the other thing is they're nocturnal, and the reason being is I'm assuming. So correct me. I mean, obviously you will, but typically the reason why they're going early in the morning and going hunting for food, and they come back when it's dark because it's safer, so they're protected more from the predators.
Well, it's also because they're visual predators themselves, so they need to be foraging at sea during daylight, so they can see the fish that they're searching for.
And one of the things I read is that they swim miles. I mean, it's not like a little ways; they sprint pretty far out too, right?
Yeah, they do. And when they have chicks, they need to, and therefore they need to return to the colony frequently.
Right.
They've got a limited range they can travel. It might be up to, say, 30 kilometers if they're doing daily trips. So what's that, about 20 miles?
30 kilometers, like
18 miles or something like that.
18 miles, yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And so that would be 30 kilometers out and 30 kilometers back. That would be a long trip for a day, but they can do that.
Right.
But with these daily trips, they're more likely to be closer to the colony because it's the more time they spend traveling, the less time they've got to spend hunting for fish and jellyfish and squid and so on. But when they don't have to return as frequently to feed the chicks, either because the chicks are a bit older or it's not the breeding season, then they can swim many, many times further than that. And so actually I mentioned before this colony that was in Port Phillip Bay, which is the bay that Melbourne is based on. And the reason that colony became established was because during the non-breeding season, the penguins from Phillip Island will enter the bay and hunt for anchovy and other fish in the bay here. And that's a distance probably of 60 or 70 kilometres by the time they get up to the top of the bay, which is a little bit too far for them to make during the breeding season when they've got to regularly come to the colony. But at other times, they can make these much, much longer trips, and potentially they can spend weeks and weeks at sea traveling around and foraging without needing to come back to land.
What is the double brooding thing? Because sometimes they'll have two, and part of it is because you guys have warmer water there than where other penguins live. Is that why? Or
well, yes, but what it means is that if a pair of penguins starts breeding relatively early in the season and then the chick fledges, there's time for them to have another go. So there's time before the water starts to cool off too much for them to lay a second clutch of eggs and potentially raise another set of chicks. So depending on the timing, and it has to also to do with the quality of the parent in the particular year, what the environmental conditions are like, and therefore whether there's a lot of prey. So in a good year, they could potentially raise 4 chicks to fledging, and even in some sort of extreme circumstances, even go for a third clutch of eggs. That would be very unusual.
wow.
But it's just a case that they are taking advantage of good conditions when they're around and making some extra investment into reproduction.
Yeah, you use that term quality of people and their mate. Can you get into that a little bit? I think you know where I'm pointing at, but can we talk a little bit of quality of mate? I think it's pretty funny.
So obviously the environment plays a big role in whether or not penguin parents are successful in raising their chicks. And by that I mean the environment determining things like water conditions and productivity and how much prey there is around. Not just how much, but where it is and what types of prey there are, because some prey are higher in quality, higher in nutritional value than others. And so when conditions are very good, then chicks get a lot to eat. They get probably a better quality of food than when conditions are not so good, and therefore they're more likely to make it to fledging, and then hopefully survive once they leave the colony, survive to return a couple of years later as adults. When conditions aren't so great, then reproductive failure happens, and when that happens, the chicks are not getting enough to eat, or they're not getting fed regularly enough. They grow poorly, and they may not survive to fledging. In extreme situations, if food availability is very poor, then the parents will just abandon breeding altogether. And when that happens, it's because they're prioritizing their own survival over the survival of the chicks. So they're only able to get enough food to feed themselves, and they stop coming back to the colony. And when that happens, of course, the chicks starve, they die. And it's a bit, it's a heartbreaking sight to see, because it won't just be one chick here or there. It'll usually be colony-wide that there are these chicks that aren't getting enough to eat, and they die. But in good years, we'll have a really high survival of chicks, and a lot of them will fledge. And so over time, these things balance out. But there are definitely differences in quality of parents too. So some parents are better foragers. They have higher reproductive success, and more of their chicks survive to fledging. Others, parents maybe that are less experienced or not as effective at hunting, or whatever the reason might be, will have lower reproductive success. And that sort of variation is natural, and you'll see it in all animals.
Well, is it the penguins that if the male is not a good provider, Nat, that they kind of get rid of him and get another one? Is that penguins, or I'm mixing my
Penguins will divorce, of course, and
right divorce. That's the term. Yeah.
and it's not necessarily that one leaves the other. We don't really know sort of who makes the decision, but what we do know is that if penguins fail, reproductively speaking, and their chicks don't survive to fledging, then they are more likely to divorce than when they have successfully raised chicks. And we know that they've divorced because in a region of the colony down at Phillip Island, we have microchipped thousands of birds over the years, many, many thousands of birds over the years. And so in a region of the colony, we know who is who. In the colony, or where the colony is sort of positioned behind the beach, and the penguins use a particular trackway to leave when they come out of the ocean. They walk across the beach and they walk up
like a path.
They walk up this path, exactly. And on the path, we've put a weighbridge, and a weighbridge is like the toll point on the highway, in that as the birds walk across it, they get weighed, but also a scanner scans their microchip, and we know who they are. So we know when the bird has left the colony because they exit over the weighbridge, and we know when it returns to the colony because they enter over the weighbridge. We know how much they weigh at each of those 2 points. And so by subtraction, we can work out how much food they have given to their chicks and how much food they catch out of the ocean the next day. And in the study region of the colony, we've put nesting boxes. And the purpose of the nesting boxes is to make it easier for us to identify when the birds have laid eggs and when the eggs hatch, etc., because we can just lift up the lid and have a look. And because those birds are microchipped, we know which 2 birds are paired together. So by coming along with a scanner, we can scan the birds that are in the box. We know who is who. We regularly check to see when they lay eggs. And we measure the growth of the chicks and how much they weigh as they're developing. And then we know, of course, whether the chicks survive and fledge or not. And so what we have seen is that there is a natural rate of divorce, and but it goes up in certain years and it declines in other years. But on average, each year, about a quarter of the pairs of birds split. And we know that they've divorced because what we see is that the following season, each of those birds is now with a different partner, as opposed to if one of the partners had died, then we would see the remaining partner in the colony with someone new, but we wouldn't see the other one. So we only count it as being divorced if we know that both of them are still alive and they're in the colony,
Right.
and then we see that now they have a new partner. And so they're much more likely to divorce if their reproductive attempts aren't successful and the chicks don't survive.
So I know you use the term divorce. Obviously, it's an easy way to describe it. Do they actually have the term widow too? I guess.
I guess we would. I can't think of a particular example where I've used that as an expression, but yes, that would be an accurate way to describe it. Yeah.
So if you use it, just remember I'm the one that came up with that idea. Just
Sure.
For real, for real, for real, for real, for real, for real, for real.
And we'll be right back. We are supported by PrepVet, providing stem cell therapy for pets.
As a pet lover, did you know your pet can benefit from the incredible healing power of stem cell therapy? Prep Therapy offers a groundbreaking solution taken right from your pet's own blood. Say goodbye to joint pain, arthritis, kidney and liver conditions, and more. They'll experience faster recovery, increased vitality, and extended quality of life without the need for surgery or harmful drugs. Put the wag back in their tail and discover Prep Therapy today at PrepVet.com. Save 10% with promo code FurRealPodcast, covered by most pet insurance.
Okay. So when you guys are doing the microchipping, how old are they generally when you're actually doing the chip?
We do that. We do the microchipping when they're still chicks, but when they're almost fully grown. And so when they're likely to sort of wander off in different areas of the colony. And it's the same process, and it's actually the same chip that your dog or cat.
Right.
So it's about the microchip's about the size of a grain of rice or a little bit larger. And it gets inserted under the skin, sort of between the shoulder blades, so in the back.
Right.
And then it's just the little hole there is when it goes.
A little fatty area.
Yeah, and the little hole that's made with the needle just gets closed up with a bit of medical glue. And they tolerate it extremely well. So, and because it's positioned in the back, when they cross the weigh bridge, the scanner is at the top there, and they sort of the weigh bridge roof is a little bit low, so the birds kind of hunch over, and that means that their back is sort of almost brushing the top of the weigh bridge.
So they can be scanned better. That's cool.
That's right, because the small microchips like that and a small scanner don't have a very big range, so we would want to make sure that the microchip comes close to the scanner so that it's accurately picked up, and that works very well. And the penguins tolerate it really well. You see them waiting in a line and crossing the crossing the weigh bridge, just like cars sort of waiting at the toll point.
Yeah, sure. That's so cool. So you probably then, I don't know how long you guys been chipping them. So you've seen generations. You've been able to watch these guys from when they're little, their entire life, and being able to see how they live in that. That's really cool.
Yeah, well, the microchipping's been going on for about, nearly 30 years. For a while, we were using flipper tags as well, and that was like a band that went around sort of the top of.
Yeah.
And the advantage of that is you didn't need a scanner, but we thought the microchip, although it seems like it would be more invasive, is actually not, because once it's in position underneath the skin, it doesn't cause any drag or anything like that. Whereas
it's subdermal, it's not a big deal.
That's right. Whereas the flipper tag sort of because it's around the outside of the flipper, can cause a bit of drag and a bit of it can rub there and wear the feathers. So we stopped using those when the microchip technology became accessible enough. So it's a much better system.
It's funny. I did an episode on hummingbirds, which are fascinating, by the way. And they put these little tiny bands on their feet. I wonder, maybe too small. I'm sure because your size is probably the smallest size they can do for chips at this point, because like you said, like a grain of rice. So
yes, there's got to be space for some electronics in there.
Right. Yeah, that's right.
And the chips themselves never wear out, because there's no battery in the chip. The battery, the power source is the scanner. So the scanner sends out a radio wave, and that energizes.
RFD?
Yes, that energizes the chip, and then the chip sends the signal back again. Whereas if the chip itself had to generate its own power,
it would wear out.
Then it would need a battery, and it's a whole different situation, and just not suitable for that sort of purpose.
Yeah. Well, I think the weighbridge deal is just really kind of fascinating, and also whoever came up with it, what a brilliant idea, because then you get so much information from that. It's crazy. You can see how they're migrating, what they're doing, where they're gone, how much they weigh. I mean, everything.
Its formal name is the Automatic Penguin Monitoring System, or APMS, but we think weighbridge works better.
All right. Well, and I don't know, is there videos out there, those guys lined up to be able to go through their little weighbridge?
Yes. Yeah, you will see, if you look online, you will see them. We have them actually in a couple of different places in the colony, but yes, that you can see some images. I'm not sure if there's video, but definitely some photos.
A big lineup of these guys getting ready. They don't even know they're getting scanned. It's like really going to the airport when you're getting scanned there.
Yeah, exactly. And sometimes there's a bit of pushing and shoving if someone decides to stop in the middle of the weighbridge. So occasionally we'll get more than one bird on the weighbridge at a time, but the weighbridge is intelligent enough to sort of separate out the weights of the two of them as they walk across.
Wow. That's so cool. Hey, so let's talk. One thing we kind of skipped over, we didn't really talk about, is the central place forage, because I know the colonies, and we talked about that one time we were on the phone, but for people that are listening, why they stay in that specific area and keep coming back?
Right. So being a central place forager means that the birds need to return to a particular location, that's the central place, because they are raising chicks there. And so that means because of the need to return to feed the chick, they leave the colony, head in whatever direction they're going to go to look for food, and then come back to that central place. And that constrains how far away they can go. And so that's a strategy that is true for most seabirds, because most seabirds breed in colonies, and all seabirds breed on land, and have to return to feed their chicks. And so it does place an important constraint on how far and how long they can go foraging for.
And when they're foraging, what are they specifically eating for everybody that's listening? I mean, I've read it, but I mean, can you go into their diet basically?
Sure. You would say that little penguins are generalist predators, meaning that they will catch pretty much anything that's out there. So most commonly, their preferred prey are small fish, like pilchards and anchovies and others, red cod and wahoo and various others. But they will also eat quite a lot of squid, and cuttlefish, etc., that they find. And then interestingly, a few years ago, we had a PhD student who was doing DNA barcoding of the scat. So that's the penguin poo.
Right.
And she had the job of collecting it, but then you can extract DNA from it. And obviously, you disregard the penguin DNA, but then you can identify the DNA of the prey species. It's a technique called metabarcoding. And when we did that, we were able to detect to the species level everything these birds had been eating. And one of the things we were quite surprised to find was that they were eating quite a lot of gelatinous zooplankton. And so that means, the stuff like jellyfish, jellyfish and salps and other things. And the reason we were surprised is because they have very low nutritional value. And if you look at a jellyfish, it's about 97% seawater. And it's, there's hardly any protein in it. It's just not a very high quality diet. Nevertheless, the little penguins were eating these jellies of different kinds. And we think because, as I said, they're generalist predators, and so they eat whatever they can catch. And the thing about eating something like a jellyfish is it will break down in the gut very quickly. So it's not like the stomach stays full of it for ages. And so they were feeding this wide variety of food to the chicks. And some of those, like the pilchards and the anchovies, are highly nutritious. Others, like the jellies, much less so. So sort of the proportion of these different dietary items will determine how good a diet overall the bird is getting.
So two things. One is talking about scat. I read that their scat is famous for being sparkly because of their diet. So it's actually sparkly because of all the fish they eat. Is that true?
I can't say I've noticed it sparkling. I've probably never looked at it.
It's not like I check scat all the time, but I thought
in quite the right conditions. I can tell you that it's ejected with considerable force, and so you have to watch where you're standing. If a penguin turns around and sort of aims its backside at you, then you'd be well advised to get out of the way, because it doesn't smell good. And it's funny. I was talking to one of my PhD students the other day who's working at the penguin colony here in Melbourne at St Kilda, and she has a young daughter who's about 4 years old, I think. And she said to me that whenever she comes home from field work, if she's been with the penguins and her daughter greets her at the door, her daughter sort of approaches to give her a big hug and then sort of sniffs her a bit and says, "Have you been at the penguins?" and if her mum says yes, she's like, "Oh, maybe I'll wait till you get changed and then give you a hug
next time." That's funny. Yeah, so in other words, if I see you at nighttime, you're sparkling, I'll know where you've been, other than smelling you.
Yeah, that's right. Well, yeah, you'll probably smell me first, I would say.
I'll smell you first, and you'll be shining later. The other thing is, too, is on the jellyfish, and I know you study turtles. The turtles eat a lot of jellyfish, too. And I always thought it was kind of weird because there isn't really much in that thing other than...
Yes, well, there's only one species of sea turtle that really focuses on the jellyfish, and that's the leatherback sea turtle.
Leatherbacks, yeah.
And they are almost exclusively eating jellyfish and other similar gelatinous prey. But the interesting thing is that they are also the largest turtles, and they grow the quickest too. So they are substituting quality for quantity. So they are just eating a massive, massive quantity of jellies. And even though the nutritional content is low, by eating a large quantity of them, they're getting the nutrition that they need. And interestingly, going back to what we were talking about right at the beginning about salt glands,
Right.
so it means that their salt glands are pumping pretty much all the time because they are eating so much salt in the jellyfish that they eat.
Right.
So this is one other point that's actually worth mentioning. So invertebrates like jellyfish
Right.
have much higher salt concentration than vertebrates like fish, because vertebrates regulate their internal salt and water environment.
Oh.
So the salt concentration in the tissues of a fish is pretty similar to the salt concentration in the tissues of a human or a penguin, because they regulate it. And it doesn't matter whether the fish lives in freshwater or saltwater, they're pretty similar. Whereas the invertebrates, like crustaceans and jellyfish and other little critters swimming around, they don't regulate their internal concentration. So if a penguin eats a jellyfish, it's actually consuming a lot more salt than if it eats a fish.
Normally, yeah.
And so in the case of the leatherbacks, because they're only eating invertebrates, they're getting a lot of salt. And as a result, they have to have this salt gland active a lot of the time to get rid of all that salt, to recover the fresh water from it that they need to maintain their own internal concentrations as a lower salt level than the surrounding seawater. And that's a major difference between invertebrates and vertebrates. So the invertebrates are
sure.
the vertebrates, include the turtles and the birds and so on, the mammals and reptiles, etc., and the fish. And the invertebrates is pretty much everything else.
It's fascinating with that. They have their own desalination plants. All of these guys do.
Yeah.
So is the little penguin or the fairy penguin or whatever we want to call them, or they're the only ones that aren't black and white, right?
Well, they are. They sort of. They're dark-ish. I mean, no, the others aren't necessarily jet black. They are all
right.
They all have a similar patterning, though.
Right.
And it's called counter shading. And it's very common in marine animals that there'll be light on the underside and dark on the top side. And that's so that when they're in the water, if they're viewed from above, it's a dark surface against a dark background. But if they're viewed from below with a white belly, it's a light surface against a light background, and it makes them harder to spot. So it's better for camouflage. Exactly. Yes.
Right.
But the penguins are all fairly dark on the back and fairly light on the stomach. So there's not a lot of color variation among them. You see, little patches of orange and yellow and so on in different species, but predominantly they're that sort of blue, dark blue, gray, black sort of color, and then white.
And then the Maori name for it is Korora, I think is how you pronounce it.
It's more like Keikaora, something like that.
Keikaora, and that means, what does it mean? It actually translates to something different, like best little diver or good tasting penguin or something like that.
I
read so many things.
To be honest, I'm not sure. No, I don't know the meaning. You'll have to ask a New Zealander.
Oh, okay. So the Maori Korora, I'm looking at my notes, means little penguin, but there's another one that name that's translated into good little diver. And then there's some mythology of a Maori guy who was a king or something, was fed a little penguin. And again, this is the internet, so just give it a pass a little bit. But it's good tasting. He wanted penguin soup, and he got one of these guys. He said, "These are good tasting penguins."
Oh, I see. I see. No, okay. I hadn't heard that before.
And then the another thing I read is they've got tons of feathers, like 10,000 feathers or something like that.
Very, very fine feathers, and that's necessary for waterproofing.
Okay.
So they'll have very, very tightly packed small feathers. That means the water doesn't penetrate through to the skin.
Sure.
Which of course is really important when they're spending so much time in the water, and that keeps them waterproof, keeps them warm, and in fact they're more likely to have problems with overheating than they are with getting cold.
Oh wow!
And so when they're on the land, if it's a really hot day, and around Melbourne, we do get very hot days in summer,
Sure.
and so the air temperature might be well over 40 degrees, which is, what's that, 100 and something Fahrenheit? I don't
40, yeah, I
I
think
don't remember quite.
I was getting confused. I got to have my conversion thing.
And Melbourne can get some really hot days when the wind comes from the north, and because it's blowing off the desert, and then penguins can be at real risk of heat stress, and they're spending a lot of energy trying to stay cool, and that's of course a concern for us if we're looking at a warming climate and greater frequency of those very hot days, and that's of course an even bigger problem for the chicks because they're not as good at regulating their body temperature as the adults are.
Right.
But I was talking about the feathers, so they're very well insulated, and then once a year they replace all of their feathers. So most other birds will have constant replacement of feathers. Feathers will drop out and new ones will be growing all the time. Whereas with the penguins, once they are done with the breeding season, so that finishes up in the early part of the year. So then as we get into the southern autumn, they have a molt, and it's called a catastrophic molt because basically it means they replace all of their feathers at once. So they fatten themselves up because during this molting period, they can't go out to sea because they're not waterproof anymore.
Right.
And so they fatten up, and then they stay in the colony for a couple of weeks replacing these feathers. Actually, it's a bit more than a couple of weeks. And during that time, they're not feeding. And therefore, from a biological point of view, it's a very stressful time for them. But they lose all their existing feathers and replace them with a brand new set. And you can see that the birds, when they've just molted, the coat's very clean and there's no ragged ends to any of the feathers and so on. And it's a brand new set of feathers. But it takes a lot of energy to do that.
So when they molt, they still have their, and I'm going to use, it's not a scientific term, it's a Mark Kyle term, they have baby feathers underneath that. So it's not skin. They're actually going to have fuzz basically at that, while they're growing the new ones.
Yeah, so the new feathers sort of push out the old ones. But no, they don't drop all their feathers and are naked and then a new set.
They look like they're plucked.
Yeah, they'd get too cold. So yes, the new ones are growing as the old ones are falling out. And you can tell when it's happening because around their burrow, at the mouth of the burrow, you'll just see all these old feathers lying on the ground. It's just all this like fluff because the feathers are very small.
Okay, so last question, which I think is important to hear, is talk to me about, I mean, it's in every species, but talk to me about climate change or in that and how that's affecting them overall, specifically, but in generality, kind of in between the two.
Sure. So Bass Strait is the body of water that these penguins are spending most of their time foraging in, and if you imagine the map of Australia,
Sure.
in the bottom right corner, the island of Tasmania is sitting
Sure.
in the southeast, and the body of water between the mainland of Australia and Tasmania is called Bass Strait, and that's where these birds are spending most of their time. And Bass Strait is warming quickly, much faster than the global average. And part of the reason for that is to do with currents. The East Australian current that runs down Australia's east coast carries warm water from the tropics down, and it's protruding further. It's coming further south than it used to. So the warm water is coming further south, and so that's influencing the sea temperature in the places where these birds forage. And generally speaking, warm water is less productive than cold water. Cold water has more oxygen, more nutrients, and can sustain more life. So that straight away is not a great situation. But because what it does is it changes the availability and the distribution of prey for the penguins. So they are going to have to forage in different locations or catch different prey and so on. However, at the moment, because penguins are generalists, they're actually very resilient to changing availability and quality of food because they can change their patterns. One of the things we have seen is that they time their reproduction to coincide with the periods of highest productivity over the summer. So really the early part of the spring and then early part of summer in the south. And that means that they can buffer themselves, if you want to think of it that way, against some of these environmental changes and disturbances.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the manifestations of that is that they've changed the timing of their breeding. So compared to about 20 or so years ago, the penguins now breed earlier in the year by nearly a couple of months. So when the season starts and when the peak of the nesting season is, or the breeding season is, earlier now than it used to be, because they have shifted to avoid the hottest part of the year, as the hottest part of the year has become hotter. And that it varies a little bit from year to year because, of course, environmental conditions vary from year to year. And that's where it's really important to have long-term data to see these sort of patterns. This is not something you can pick up by studying an animal for a couple of years. You need 30 years worth of data and really comprehensive data, and that's what we have, largely in thanks to the weighbridge, which is collecting all this data of who's in the colony and who's still alive, etc., by from the microchips, but also through this series of honours students that we've had that each year are in the colony monitoring the reproductive success, etc., so that we can tell year by year how well has the colony done overall. And we see definite patterns, and that warm years are generally associated with poorer reproductive success. The penguins are buffering themselves to a certain extent, but our concern is that they will reach the point where they can't buffer themselves any further, and we'll start to see some really serious consequences. And as I mentioned a bit earlier, air temperature is a concern because they can't really cool off. If it's really hot during the day and they're having to look after their chicks, they can't just disappear and go into the water and cool down.
Right.
They've got to stay with the chicks, and so heat waves can cause really serious chick mortality. So our concern is that with greater frequency and intensity of both marine heat waves and land heat waves, chick survival and adult survival will be compromised.
Are you seeing any kind of migration to, I don't know, I mean, I've been to Australia several times. I've been to New Zealand. I know where Tasmania is. Is there cooler areas? Are they migrating at all to like maybe a cooler environment, or does it pretty much across the country that's pretty much the same thing?
Well, there are small colonies around the place in Tasmania. There's also colonies in New Zealand in cooler waters. But those colonies are small. There's nothing like the size of the colony at Phillip Island, and so to rely on those colonies to sort of be the seeds to protect the future of the species is pretty unlikely.
Right.
And Phillip Island is already pretty much as far south on the mainland of Australia as you get.
Right, I know where it is.
And so they haven't really got much option to shift other than to head down to Tasmania. And there's a couple of other offshore islands that might be possible. But it takes a lot to establish and maintain a new colony. The conditions have to be right, and also the food has to be available in the right sort of proximity. And then there's the penguins nearly all nest on islands, because mainland predators will kill them.
Right, yeah, because it's usually dogs and cats and
that's whatever, right. And I mean, there's natural predators as well, of course, but one of the reasons that the colony at St Kilda has been successful is that the birds at St Kilda, and so this is a suburb of Melbourne. If anyone wants to Google St Kilda colony, you'll see photos like these penguins standing, and the city of Melbourne, the CBD of Melbourne, is in the background. There's some really beautiful photos of at night of the lights of the city. So they're only a few kilometres from the centre of Melbourne, but they nest in a rocky breakwater, and that breakwater was built in the 1950s when Melbourne hosted the Olympics, because all the yachting events were taking place at the St Kilda Yacht Club. And they built this breakwater then so they could have these Olympic competitive yachts in there and just protect them from the waves. And at some point, no one knows exactly when, but at some point, birds from Phillip Island discovered that breakwater at St Kilda and colonized it. And then in the 1970s, people noticed that there were penguins there, and that colony's been going from strength to strength, and it's now about 1,500 birds.
Wow.
And so we have a PhD student who's working at that colony to understand their foraging patterns and so on. But the reason that colony is successful is because to get to the breakwater, there's a long jetty.
Mm-hmm.
And it's long enough that a dog or a cat or even a fox is not going to cross it because it's also lit at night. And that's protected them. And there's been a very few instances where a fox did get across. Some construction work was happening and it provided an access point and the lights were off. But that got stopped pretty quickly. And as a result now, the only problems ever caused by the colony at St Kilda are actually people who get in there and fool around in an area that they can access. Most of the breakwater is behind a locked security gate, but not all of it. And the same is actually true at Phillip Island. So it's an island, that's where the very large colony is, and there's a bridge that connects the island to the mainland. And they have eradicated foxes on the island itself, but there was an instance some years ago where a fox was getting across and was impacting local wildlife. So they set up some cameras on the bridge and they realized that the fox was walking over the bridge at night. And so
why is the fox?
So the rangers got out there and they tracked it and removed that fox. So now the colony is safe, but that's why they are on islands and not mainlands. Therefore, they have to find the right sort of island if a colony is going to try and move or establish somewhere else.
Well, first of all, this is fascinating. I've got about 30 more questions for you, and I know it's a morning for you there and night here. So I'll let you go on, except for I'm going to make you tell the silly joke.
Oh, yes. Okay. Well, it's not a penguin joke, but it's a turtle joke.
Perfect.
So at a police station, a turtle comes into the police station and says to the officer on duty, says, something terrible has happened. I have to report a robbery. And the policeman says, okay, tell me what happened. And the turtle says, well, I was up on the beach. I was laying my eggs and these two snails came along and mugged me, stole all my eggs. It was terrible. The police officer says, it sounds pretty bad. Can you give me a description of these snails? And the turtle says, I don't know. It just happened so fast.
I got it. That's great. Actually, that's a really good one compared to my number one. I'm going to tell you one offline when we get off here in a second.
Okay.
My joke for you, but I'm going to save that. Everybody else is listening. So everybody out there, as I always say, if you've got a great joke, you want your kids to tell a joke, your nieces, nephews, you want to tell a joke, please. I don't want to torture the guest, and I don't want to torture you with my jokes. So if you can do that, send me an email at mkyle@forrealpodcast.com. Or if you've got a great idea for the show, like the one today, please reach out to me. And I promise you, I get back to everybody. Again, mkyle@forrealpodcast.com. Lastly, Richard, thanks so much for being on. This was great.
My pleasure, Mark. Great to talk to you.
Oh, anytime I can talk to anybody from Australia, but this was just fascinating for me. And like I have always told you, I wanted to suck it all in because it's so great. And then lastly, for everybody else that's listening, as I always say, keep following, keep listening. But most importantly, thank you so much for being part of this adventure that I'm on. Really, really, truly, from the bottom of my heart, for real.
That concludes this episode of For Real with your host, Mark Kyle. For previous and future episodes of For Real, listen via all major podcast streaming sites.